Bitcoin is digital money. To understand what that means, and to understand why Bitcoin is the most important thing in today's world, we need to ask ourselves, what is money? To do that, we need to look at the history of money. So let's set our minds back. No matter what your belief system, most likely human beings at one stage were primitive. We were foraging, hunting, and gathering. Then at some point, probably when we started to develop tools, we started to specialize in a certain type of trade, whether you're a farmer, whether you produce textiles. And this is called the division of labor. If I focus all of my attention on what I'm good at, and you do the same, then we can swap those items. And that means the standard of living for both of us increases at a faster rate than if I had to produce all of the things that I needed. Now, in the early stages, you can imagine in a small village, for example, that people would just be swapping these items between each other and keeping track, some form of bartering system. And bartering works absolutely fine on those small scales because people trust each other, there's no violence, you can keep track of who owes what, you don't need to cross long regions in order to deliver items. But bartering does not scale. As soon as you start going to different towns or even countries where there's different cultures and languages, there are threats of violence. You have to transport goods and services a long way. I have to have my cows ready at the same time your wheat is ready. We always have to be agreeing different prices with all the areas that we're trading them in. We have to cross rivers and mountains, and it starts to break down very, very quickly. So what we need is a good or a product to sit in the middle of each of those transactions. And of course, that thing becomes the money. And without going too deep in this video, you can essentially boil human history down to its search for the best money. In fact, each age or civilization can be characterized by the type of money that they were using. And the success or failure of that civilization was often tied to how good the money was. So we've tried many different things as money, from beads to stones to salt, gold, silver, paper notes, and many others. And they all had certain pros and cons. Most of these monies fell down because they weren't very scarce. Take salt, for example. Salt was a good money for a while as far as we understand it, but as soon as we developed the technology to scrape the ocean floor, salt essentially became infinite. And if you were holding your money in salt at the time, you just had an infinite amount of new money enter the system, and pretty soon after, salt stopped becoming money. And that actually is a good representation of what is happening today, which we'll talk about a bit later in the video. Now, as far as we know it, we do have to be careful because history is written by the victors. But it seems like humanity has landed upon gold as the best money twice. The first time being the Roman Empire. In fact, it does seem that the very first times that we used gold coins were part of the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire is one of the greatest, if not the greatest empire that ever existed. And they managed to take over the whole world on the foundation of using gold as their monetary standard. That is until Emperor Nero decided it would be a good idea to tell all of the citizens to hand in their gold and their silver, and he clipped the sides off of the coins. It melted down that extra metal and created new coins, and then gave the original coins back to the population and said, don't worry, this is still worth the same. But now he'd introduced a whole lot more gold and silver into circulation. This is called currency debasement. Again, this is what is happening in today's world, which we'll tie to later. The fall of the Roman Empire can really be traced back to when they started to debase the money. This is what we see today in terms of money printing and the fall of the US empire. Now fast forward through history, a number of ages and some dark ages, and we get to the second half of the 1800s. And basically all at the same time, the whole world landed back upon the gold standard. This time there was no particular government who was telling the people to use gold. Humanity as a collective landed upon gold as money. And once again, humanity flourished just like in the Roman Empire. This time, along with technology, we saw massive advances in life expectancy, in health, standard of living, art, culture, and trade. Also, there was very little warfare around this time. And again, this was because gold was being used as money, gold being a very, very good money. Why is gold in particular a very good money? Well, it hits a lot of the functions of money, such as it is divisible, it is portable, it is fungible, so I know my gold is going to be the same as your gold. It's indestructible. I know that I can hand it down to many generations and it's still going to exist. But the main reason why gold is the best money that we've found to date is because it's relatively scarce. All of the gold ever mined can fit into 2.5 Olympic-sized swimming pools, and that is worth $10 trillion. When the money is scarce, that means it becomes a good store of value. So if I'm saving the fruits of my labour in gold, I know that no government or no bank can go and make loads more gold. Now, there is a small inflation rate in gold, which is about 1.5%, which means we mine about 1.5% more gold per year by getting it out of the ground. But I know whatever I'm saving in gold, they can only make 1.5% of it more per year. They could make a tiny bit more if they put more capital into getting it out of the ground. But the point is, it's very hard to get gold out of the ground. That's why gold is known as a fantastic store of value. There's an analogy that you can buy a Savile Row suit today for about 1 ounce of gold, about $2,000, and you could buy a Savile Row suit 100 years ago for 1 ounce of gold and 100 years before that. It holds its value over time. Now, there's a big issue for those in charge of the world, politicians and bankers, when the world is on a gold standard, and that is that they're accountable to the gold that they have. So if a government wants to do a welfare program or wants to do a war, well, they can only spend the amount of gold that they have in their reserves. If they don't have the gold, they have to ask the people for taxes to pay for the program or for the war. But they don't have infinite resources. And that's a problem for those that want to get more control and more wealth. So it is no surprise that in the year 1913, the Federal Reserve Law Act was passed, and then immediately in 1914 we had the beginning of World War I. We get told some stories about World War I, how a prince was shot and it caused the whole world to go to war. However, World War I is known as the Central Bankers' War because they were funding all sides of the war. So all in unison, basically every country said to their population, we have to go to war with the bad guys. Every country positions themselves as the good guys and the other side as the bad guys. And this one is really bad. It's a world war, and we don't want to tax you for it because it will be too expensive. So what we're going to do is temporarily suspend the gold standard, which means that we will print paper notes which are backed by gold, and therefore they're as good as gold, which is where the expression comes from. We won't really keep track of how much we're doing. Maybe we'll print more paper notes than there is gold. But don't worry, because at the end of the war, we're going to go back to the gold standard after we've defeated the bad guys. Now, unfortunately, there's nothing as permanent as a temporary government program. And with a few small exceptions, the whole world basically remained off of the gold standard from that point. And then we had, from World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, war on drugs, war on terror, war on viruses, and of course I'm missing some out. But all of these wars essentially happen for the same reason. They happen so that those in control can point over there and say there's something really bad happening. Number one, distract you from what's actually happening behind the scenes. And number two, tell you that there's a very, very good reason why they need to print lots of paper notes, print money. Of course, nowadays it doesn't actually happen on paper notes. It happens by pressing a button on a keyboard and they magic trillions of dollars into the money supply. Why is this a problem? Why is money printing a problem? Well, we need to think about the impacts that it has. So the impact that it has on most people, let's say 99% of people who save the product of their labor. When they go to work, they put their value in the local currency, dollars, pounds, euros. And when a lot more of this currency is brought into circulation without your say-so, by the way, it's certainly not a democracy in this respect, well, the value of the currency that you already hold goes down significantly. Imagine if you held all of the money in the world, 100 units of money, and then without your say-so, somebody made 100 more. Well, you've gone from owning 100% of all the world's money to 50% of all the world's money. Now, obviously, that's a very basic example, but every time that they come up with a reason to print millions and then billions and now trillions, the value of your currency goes down. How does this show up? It shows up in inflation. The prices of goods and services go up. This is why people like me, but I'm not special, many people, at the beginning of March 2020, when they locked the world down and they said, we're going to do whatever it takes to save the economy. Whatever it takes means they're going to print a lot of money. Ended up being about $10 trillion globally. People like me were shouting that we're going to have a massive inflation problem because you can't increase the money supply by that much and not see a massive increase in the prices. And about a year later, as prices started to go up, bankers and politicians came out and they said, don't worry, this is only transitory. And people like me again were saying, no, it's not transitory. About a year later, bankers and politicians have come out saying, oh, we've got a massive problem with inflation. We now have a cost of living crisis, and we couldn't have seen this coming. On the flip side, the impact that this has on a small group of people, the top 1%, the top 5%, depending on how you cut it, those people that have the majority of their money put away in assets, particularly scarce assets, land, real estate, gold, silver, stocks, Bitcoin, for example. These people see their wealth increase dramatically when money is printed. And that's because now there are more units of currency in circulation, but they're the same amount of assets. So the prices and the value of these assets also increases. That's why from 2020 to the end of 2021, you saw Bitcoin, you saw stock markets, and you saw real estate markets go up dramatically. So how did Bitcoin play into all of this? Cast our minds back to 2008, we had the great financial crisis. And at the end of 2008 and then beginning of 2009, we had the release of Bitcoin. Let's tackle a sensitive subject early on. Bitcoin was released by a pseudonymous person called Satoshi Nakamoto. We don't know who that is. It was released in the dark corners of the web on some hacker and coder mailing lists and forums. Now, as you can imagine, there have been a lot of attempts at creating a digital money. It's weird that the internet doesn't have a money given how long the internet has now been around. So many people have tried to create a digital money, but it had failed for one reason or another. Now, when people find out that Bitcoin was created by we don't know who, some people freak out, and I did at the beginning as well, because human beings naturally want an answer. But when you actually think about it and look into it, you realize that it had to happen this way. Governments and central banks control the money supply. They get all of their power from that control of the money supply. So of course they would never just let the people have a new money. And that's why Satoshi did it this way. He covered all of his tracks. He released it in the darkness, did some early work on it along with some early adopters, and then disappeared. From the moment Satoshi disappeared, Bitcoin took on a life of its own. It had no ruler and became fully decentralized. And that is important because it means there's no central point of attack. There is no person, entity, corporation that can be co-opted, that can be bribed, that can be thrown in jail. Now, Bitcoin was released in 2009 as a response to the great financial crisis. In Satoshi's early work, he references the fact that governments and bankers were once again going to bail out the banking system, i.e. use taxpayers' money to save the banking system. And he writes about the fact that we cannot trust that they won't devalue the money, that they won't print money, and we have to trust that the banks won't lend out our money. Of course, we can't trust that because they do print money and the banks do lend out our money. So how does Bitcoin fix all of that, and why is it so important? Well, Bitcoin is two things, and it's important to separate them out. Number one, Bitcoin is a network. It's a peer-to-peer payments network. So I can send you Bitcoin, you can send me Bitcoin, we can be anywhere in the world, I can click a button and it will arrive in your wallet. Now this is very important because in the current banking system, you need permission from a third party, whatever that bank is, whatever bank you're trying to send money to, you need permission to be able to do a transaction. And we're seeing more and more how banks are becoming harder to use, telling you where you can and can't send your money, making it really difficult to send money abroad. Of course, banks are getting pressured by governments and regulators to make all of their checks very strict and to collect all of your personal information. So Bitcoin allows you to sit outside of that system. Nobody can freeze your funds. Nobody can tell you when you can and can't spend your funds. All you need is a wallet and you can interact with anybody else on the Bitcoin network. The Bitcoin network is completely decentralized. I'm not getting into the technicals in this video. Think about when you buy a mobile phone, you don't ask how the microchip works. You just want to know that it sends messages and has a good camera. So with regards to Bitcoin, you can go very deep into the actual technical setup of the Bitcoin network and how it's run on hundreds of thousands of computers and how it is the most decentralized and the most secure computing network in the world. But all you need to know is you can send money and receive money to and from any Bitcoin address with the click of a button at very little cost. That is the Bitcoin network. Now, the second thing that Bitcoin is the actual token or the coin. This is what we call money. So there are only 21 million Bitcoin that can ever exist. This number is very important, 21 million. It's not important what this number is. It could be 10 million, it could be 30 million, but it's 21 million. What's really important is that it is an absolute supply cap of 21 million. There will be no more Bitcoin created after that. Nobody can create the 21 millionth and one Bitcoin. Now, why is this important? It's because if I own one Bitcoin, I own 1/21 millionth of the total supply. I know that nobody can ever change that. So I can hold that one Bitcoin for as long as I want to hold on to it for. I can even pass it down to my children, grandchildren, and they will always own that same percentage of the total supply. This is the opposite to what is happening in today's world, where no matter how much units of fiat currency you own, they're printing infinite amounts of new units of fiat currency, and therefore the value of what you already hold is going down. In a Bitcoin world, you always own the same percentage, and hopefully you're accumulating more, so you're actually owning a higher and higher percentage of the total supply. The reason why this is important, going back to the example of gold, Bitcoin becomes a store of value. And Bitcoin is actually better than gold in this respect, because if you remember, I said that we create 1.5% more gold per year. Well, nobody can create an extra Bitcoin, 21 million full stop. So Bitcoin is actually more scarce than gold. It's actually the only real thing in this world that is absolutely scarce. We can never create more of it. The only other thing that's absolutely scarce is our time in this body, but we don't know where that cap is on how long we're going to be in this body. With Bitcoin, we know there's only 21 million. There's nothing like it in the world. So this absolute scarcity means that as more people realize that, number one, it's scarce, and number two, that it's a payment system that sits outside of the current banking system, they choose to move some of their savings and investments into Bitcoin rather than having it in fiat currency or even stocks or real estate or gold or elsewhere. And this is what causes the price of Bitcoin to rise. Bitcoin has gone from zero in 2008, and at the peak it was worth $69,000 per Bitcoin. As I'm talking about this, we've come down a lot. Bitcoin is about 60% off its peak and is currently worth about $30,000 per Bitcoin. So moving forwards, what do I expect to see from Bitcoin and how should you think about it? Well, I do not expect, and you can ask yourself the same question, I do not expect governments and central banks to stop printing money. They actually can't. We live in a debt-based, credit-based system, and every time that they print money, the money becomes worth less and less and less, and there's more and more debt in the system. What this means on a long enough time frame is they have to keep printing money, and every time they have to print more money in order to keep the music playing. That's why between 2020 and 21, they printed about $10 trillion globally. So particularly when the next crisis comes, whether that's a banking crisis or a war on the climate, whatever that is, next time they're probably going to have to print $20 trillion, because if not, the whole system will come crashing down. And they don't want the system to come crashing down because they're in control of the current system. So they don't want anarchy. They want the system to keep going for as long as possible, because the longer it goes, the more control and the more wealth that they accumulate. So there will be a next crisis, there will be another round of money printing, and that means the value of the currency will continue to go down. It means anybody that keeps their savings in the bank or in cash will continue to see their purchasing power decrease as inflation increases. A lot of people don't understand this, and this is why they work for 50 years, they took away their savings, and they feel like they're never escaping the rat race, they're on a hamster wheel, and they retire with not as much money as they hoped for and expected. This is going to get worse and worse and worse because they're going to print more money and inflation is going to get higher. If you believe that thesis, if you believe that to be correct and that they're not going to stop doing that and start doing things the right way, well, then you have to find somewhere in order to put your money, to put your savings, to make sure that you don't lose everything as they continue to devalue the money. Now, historically, you could have put your savings in gold or in land, and you can still absolutely do that. I'm sure that will serve people very well over the next decade or so. But this time we do have another option. We have gold 2.0. We've talked about how Bitcoin improves upon gold in that it's more scarce. We haven't talked about how Bitcoin improves upon gold in that it's easy to send. It's very hard to send $1 million worth of gold to the other side of the planet. It's very easy for me to send $1 million worth of Bitcoin to the other side of the planet. So I believe that gold was the best money that human beings had found up until 2008. And from that point, we have been in a process of learning and awakening to this new money, this digital money called Bitcoin, which is now the greatest money that human beings have ever found. I believe more people are going to see the need for Bitcoin, to find somewhere to put their savings that can't be printed away, to find somewhere to put their savings that sits outside of the current system where they're not told what they can and can't do with it and they can't have their accounts frozen. And as more people realize this, more money, more investments, more capital is going to flow out of the current system and into Bitcoin. As Bitcoin adoption continues to increase, which it has done for the past 14 years, the price of Bitcoin is going to continue going up. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be very volatile. In fact, it is going to be very volatile. That is the nature of Bitcoin. It's a brand new technology. It's been around for 14 years. People are trying to figure it out. And it gets a lot of heat and a lot of propaganda from the media and from governments, as you would expect, because it's a threat to the current system. All of this creates massive, massive volatility. But if you take the volatility out of it, what Bitcoin has done for 14 years has gone up. I expect the next 10 to 14 years is going to be exactly the same. is going to be extremely volatile, but Bitcoin is going to continue to significantly increase in value and purchasing power. Depending on your personal situation will depend upon how much of your net worth, of your savings, how much you will save in Bitcoin. For somebody that's older, cannot stand the volatility, maybe you have lots of dependencies, and maybe you don't know much about Bitcoin yet. For you, it's probably going to be a small amount. I recommend that nobody is on zero Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the biggest asymmetric bet in the world. If I'm wrong, if other Bitcoiners are wrong, the price could go down. It won't go down to zero because at 1 pence, I will buy them all, and there are many other Bitcoiners that would do so as well. But sure, the price could go down. But if we're right and Bitcoin is the best money that we've ever found and continues on this exponential adoption path, then the price will only continue to go up drastically, particularly as they print trillions more, and part of that ends up in the Bitcoin network. So if I'm right and Bitcoiners are right, Bitcoin goes to $1 million, $10 million and beyond. That's why nobody should really be on zero Bitcoin. Now, for you, it may be a very small amount, it may be 1%. If you're younger, if you can withstand the volatility, if you understand Bitcoin more, maybe it's a larger amount. You have to do that work, you have to do that due diligence and make your own investing decisions. For me, the answer is clear. All roads lead to Bitcoin. And because of that, I will continue to show up here and on my other channels and try and give you the information that I have and my understanding of what Bitcoin is, why Bitcoin is important.